Hey, welcome back to the Marianne Hickman Show. Today we are in Talk Tips number 46, and this is really a part 2 of how to make a more engaging presentation. Check it out. Now, in the last Talk Tips, I talked a lot about how to create an engaging presentation from the presenter's perspective. I didn't even touch slide work, which is why I wanted to go into this today. Now, I'm going to be having some images show up on the screen for you so you can follow along with this PDF, and then I will make this PDF downloadable for you. I need to make sure that I give credit where credit is due, though. I did not make this PDF. I got this from a friend of mine on Facebook named Fletcher Hammel, and he made this available for everybody. And I thought, oh my gosh, Fletcher, this is so brilliant. Can I have your permission to share it with my people? So here you go. I want to show this to you because it is going to help you make slides that are not boring, not overly crowded, and actually helpful for your audience. When you're creating slides in your keynote, the first principle of not creating crappy slides is the principle of contrast. Now, look on the screen. Let me show this to you right here. Contrast is increasing the visual difference when they exist, pairing dissimilar fonts, colors, etc. to draw attention. If, for example, your slide font is too close to the slide background in color, it's going to be hard and therefore unpleasant to read. You want the contrast to be there. I always like to tell people with your branding, when you're creating your brand kit, maybe in Canva, to have two fonts. One font that is your main body and one maybe scripted font that is an accent font. And I stick to those two fonts regularly throughout my entire branding so it becomes recognizable. Look around. If you ever see, Wells Fargo or Vasa Fitness or any other big companies that you know, you're going to see commonality in their fonts and contrasting in their colors. So again, this principle of contrast. Let's take a look at number 2, or R, in order to avoid crappy presentations, is the principle of repetition. Let me read this for you. Repetition. Constantly repeat and consistently repeat graphic elements throughout the design to create the expectation and reinforce unity. In the example that Fletcher gives, he gives the example of the way that Google designs all of their little icons. They have the same repetition. They're in the same family. They look familiar. Okay, so you can see here that in the example that Fletcher gives, there are different Google icons. There's the Google icon for the meetings, the emails, your drive. All of them have the same kind of color scheme to them. They all have the block red, yellow, blue, and green. You can see all of it is common and repeated throughout their entire system. Now, keeping in that same vein, when you're creating your own documents, your own PDFs, your own files, not only do you want to have the contrast, but you want to repeat things that stay on brand for you. Use the same font. Maybe 2, but use the same 2 fonts. Don't go crazy and create 3. I once received, believe it or not, a big stack of paperwork from someone who claimed to be a very, very successful company. And this stack of paperwork instantly lost credibility with me because the first half of it was written in Comic Sans. And the last half of it was written in Times New Roman, and the fonts kept changing and the spacing kept changing. There was no consistency, no repetition, in other words. So when you're using graphics, when you're using clip art, or whatever they call it these days, make sure that it all comes from the same family. If I'm going to pull images or clip art images into my keynote or into my ebooks, I'm going to keep within that same font family. If I start using stick figures, I'm going to stay using stick figures. If I start using illustrations, I'm going to stay in that same font family of illustrations. It's like reading a book. Imagine if you're reading an illustrated book and they changed illustrators halfway through the book. It would make no sense. So stay consistent and repetitive with your own graphic and design. All right, step number 3 of avoiding crappy keynotes is alignment. Remember what I said before about having spacing that jumped around everywhere and margins that jump around everywhere? This is what we're talking about. We want to avoid that, especially as you go between slides. Things should be predictably repetitive and aligned within the slide and within the slide series. So here's what this says. Every element in the layout should connect to another to avoid arbitrary placement and increase readability. This is very, very important, especially if your slide has a little more than normal font or text on it, like it's a legal disclaimer slide. We don't love to read that whole thing, but all of it needs to be on there, sort of thing. So ensure that each piece of your design is connected to another piece of your design in some way. Okay, now the last one, key for how to avoid a crappy keynote, is this. Group related items close together to create visual units that organize information and increase legibility, or in other words, proximity. Okay, so for example, take a restaurant menu. This is the example that they give in the slides. Restaurant menus have the same units or the same type of item grouped into forms. They have the breakfast items together. They have the beverage items together. It's not the beverage items are mixed in with the entrees, mixed in with the and what do they call those, appetizers? Yeah, everything's not mixed together. Everything is grouped and organized into proximity, or they have proximity with each other. So organize your ideas in a way that not only is aligned well, has great contrast, has repetitive fonts, but so the ideas naturally flow and stick to one another with this proximity. Now, there's a couple bonus pieces I want to redirect your attention to. Let's check this out. Hierarchy. This is a really cool graphic. I don't know if you've seen this blue graphic. This one says, you will read this first in the biggest, boldest font. People don't always read things top to bottom, left to right. They read it when it is in the hierarchy of visibility. So people read the biggest, boldest, loudest fonts first, and then they read the next biggest, boldest, loudest fonts, and then they're going to read the next biggest, boldest, loudest fonts and follow all the way through to the smallest fonts if they feel like they should keep on reading. So whatever's going to come biggest, boldest, and loudest, that's what your audience is going to read first. Okay, this last principle, last bonus piece is called gestalt. This is the use, in other words, of negative space. The use of negative space has several components. Now, if you are thinking in terms of using negative space in your keynotes, this is simply also to say that the sum is greater than the total of its parts, meaning there's a lot going on, but very, very simply here. So for example, if I have 3 points to create transformation, I might say, hey, I'm going to share with you 3 of the 12 points. The rest of the 12 will be downloadable at the end. I'm using mental negative space to create continuity. I'm creating so much value by giving you the 3 and then giving you the rest when I'm done that I've created a total that is greater than the sum of its parts. This can also be done visually with design. So I'm going to point this out and say, when you're designing, observe the negative space that you create. Is it overbearing? Is the negative space too loud? And I'm going to say, word to the wise, watch your acronyms. Here's what this means. When you have these words that line up in maybe a bullet pointed sheet, look at the acronyms as they stream down the page on the left-hand side. If it spells a word and you don't want it to spell that word, change your layout, change your wording, change your verbiage. A lot of companies have gotten in trouble for accidental or maybe intentional/unintentional acronyms that light up along the sides. So check your wordings. And then last but not least, I will say that you should have someone else QC check your slides because you're going to miss stuff. Trust me, the longer you stare at something, the more you're going to miss. And with your keynote slides, one of the things that a smart feedback person will tell you is that you're likely going to cut out 30 to 60% of your slides. Totally eliminate them, because you don't want your slides to carry the message. That's what you're there for. Thank you for coming to this episode of Talk Tips. Write your questions down for me in the comments, and I'll record a Talk Tips just for you. Thanks for being here.
Marianne Hickman here again. Listen, I hope super helpful for you. Maybe you'll learn something new. Share with me in the comments what was valuable. Or if you have this whole separate question like, hey, I wanted to know about this. I wanted to know about stage fright. I want to know how about my presentation on stage. I want to know about how to dress on stage. Anything that you want to know that's relevant to growing your business through stages, put in the questions. Because guess what? I go through and answer all of those personally. That's not an agency or a VA. That's me going through and looking at your questions because you are who I am here for. So last thing is I want you to get this database. If you haven't gotten it already, now I've got thousands of downloads on this thing, so maybe you got it, but if not, make sure you go to mariannehickman.com/database. What that's going to do is take you to a page. You're going to input all of your information. We're going to send the database to you. You're going to request access to it. I keep it locked down so I can make sure I get it to just the right people. And you're going to request access. And then once you have that, you're going to go through and apply to podcasts that have the topic that you'd be an expert speaking on. Here's the thing. I get this database updated twice a week. So there's always new stuff in there. And if you're a podcaster, there's even a list of 400 plus guests that you can have on your show on that podcast. Maybe you end up doing a podcast swap and you grow your audience that way. Regardless, I want you to get it. So mariannehickman.com/database, and we'll see you in the next Talk Tips.